Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the second lecture to cover the fundamentals of respiration. In this part, we're going to take a look at gas exchange and how the law of diffusion drives gas exchange between the outside environment and our body. From there, we'll take a look at the mechanics of breathing and how breathing actually helps us with our gas exchange. And finally, we're going to start turning to the marine mammals, taking a look at their ability to dive, and in particular, their ability to hold their breath for long periods of time, a process known as apnea. So let's get started. In a previous lecture, we learned about the respiratory structures, and in particular, we learned that the deepest respiratory structures are called the alveoli, and they resemble almost hollow bunches of grapes. Those alveoli are where the gas exchange actually takes place between the respiratory structures and the cardiovascular system. So the alveoli are where it's at. In other words, we're going to move into that area of the respiratory structure and take a look at how gases are exchanged between the airspace and the bloodstream that basically climbs right up underneath it. So let's go ahead and take a look. What I've done here in this picture is actually diagrammed a simplified version of an alveolus. So the alveolus is represented by a circle, and it looks like it's holding quite a bit of oxygen in it. And directly underneath it, I've done a simplified version of a blood vessel that's coming right up underneath it in attempts to extract oxygen. So our goal here is basically to take the oxygen from the alveolus and put it into the blood, and that's what we want to do. Unfortunately, we can't force the issue. We have to rely on a process known as diffusion. So all gases follow diffusion. And what diffusion is basically the idea that whenever you have a concentrated gradient in one area, that gases or any type of molecules will naturally spread out until they are in equilibrium. You probably actually have experienced this yourself. If you've ever taken cologne or perfume and sprayed a little bit, when you first spray it, the perfume or cologne molecules are really concentrated right where you've just sprayed. And so because of that, it smells really potent. But after a while, those perfume or cologne molecules diffuse out. And so when you walk back into the room, let's say half an hour later, it doesn't smell quite so potent in any one area because the molecules have actually diffused out. So this is the process known as diffusion, and this is the exact law that oxygen and CO2 are going to follow. So what that means is that in order to coax oxygen from going from the alveolus into the bloodstream right underneath it, we actually need to establish a gradient or oxygen disequilibrium. We need to make sure that the oxygen is more concentrated in the alveolus in order to kind of force it to go into a less concentrated area, that of the bloodstream. So to load oxygen into the blood, we always have to make sure that there's more oxygen in the alveolus than the blood. And when that happens, when we do have that oxygen disequilibrium, what we end up seeing is that the oxygen indeed does move from the alveolus into the bloodstream as shown on the screen here. So that happens in a couple seconds. So then what happens? Well, we need to restore that disequilibrium. How do we do that? We breathe. So ultimately, breathing helps restore the oxygen disequilibrium that is needed in order to ensure the oxygen gas moves from the alveolus into the blood. Because until it's in the blood, it doesn't belong to us. Even if it's inside your body, if it's not in your bloodstream, you haven't actually captured oxygen that's usable for the cells. It has to get into the bloodstream in order to be delivered to the cells so they can use it to make ATP. So with that, let's go ahead and summarize. So for gas exchange and breathing, we know that all gas exchange follows the law of diffusion. I did an example with oxygen, but the same rule applies for carbon dioxide as well. So in other words, to move gases such as oxygen from the lungs into the blood, you need to constantly replenish the concentration gradient or the disequilibrium of oxygen in the alveoli. Breathing does this. So why do we breathe? We breathe to continuously make sure there's always a higher oxygen gradient in the alveolus than the blood. And this is how we load up oxygen in our bloodstream. So with that, let's turn to breathing mechanics. Okay, when you talk about taking a breath, you're really talking about two processes that happen one right after the other. In one breathing cycle, you have inspiration, which is more commonly known as inhalation, and expiration, which is more commonly known as exhalation. Both together represent one cycle. So what I want you to do right now is take a really deep breath. As you take a deep breath, you'll notice that you first start with inhaling. One big breath, and then when you exhale, you release that air. So of course, inhaling brings the oxygen in, and then exhaling spits the old air out, including a lot of CO2. How do we breathe? What are the mechanics of that breathing? Well, as it turns out, we actually have to change the volume of our thoracic cage in order to achieve a breath. So breathing, although it feels natural because we do it all the time and we do it without thinking, you actually have to change the size of your rib cage in order to do it. So let's take a look at how that happens. During inspiration or inhalation, if you take a really deep breath and you go ahead and you put your hands anywhere on your rib cage, you'll feel that your rib cage expands out. If you take a deep breath, it's pretty obvious. So the rib cage is expanding out, pulling out the lungs. Also, the diaphragm, which is a muscular sheet that kind of is on the floor of the lung, it contracts and it pushes down. And when it pushes down, both the pushing down of the diaphragm and the pulling out of the lungs both work to increase the volume of the thoracic cage. That creates almost like a vacuum, and as a result, air gets sucked into the lungs, and that is what causes inspiration. Expiration is actually a little easier to imagine. During expiration, your rib cage relaxes and shrinks, and your diaphragm relaxes and pushes back up. And as a result, you literally force the air out. If you were to take an inflatable toy of any type, open up the cap and then squeeze, you would be changing the volume of that inflatable toy. And what you would be doing is shrinking the volume. When you do that, of course, you know that air comes out the cap. So in the same way, by shrinking the volume of our lungs, we push air out. So ultimately, breathing is monitored and governed by the fact that we change our rib cage. Now, as it turns out, you can take any human and basically equip them with a machine that will measure how much air they actually move in a single breath cycle. And it's quite variable. You can breathe in and out a lot, or you can breathe in and out a little bit. So usually when you are at rest, so you're just sitting at home, resting, you're not exercising, the amount of air that you exchange in one breath is actually not very much. And we call that volume the tidal volume. So the tidal volume is considered to be the amount of air exchanged during one breathing cycle, so one inspiration and expiration at rest. And for an adult human, the average tidal volume is only half a liter, and actually sometimes quite a bit less. So if you think about what half a liter is, think of a 2-liter bottle and then think of about a quarter of it. And that's how much air you move in every breath. Well, as it turns out, your entire respiratory structure holds a whole lot more air than that, like 4 or 5 liters worth. So half a liter is really only a small fraction. You're looking at moving anywhere between 10 and 15% of the total amount of air in any given breath. So what does that mean? It means that we're only exchanging like 10 or 15% of our air during every breath, considering that we're at rest, which means we're not replacing our oxygen supply very quickly. But that's okay because we just breathe all the time. We breathe continuously. So for humans, we don't need a great tidal volume because we simply just keep breathing over and over and over again. Marine mammals don't always have that luxury, as we're going to see in another lecture. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and actually turn to marine mammals and take a look at diving. So when we take a look at marine mammals, of course, marine mammals have the ability to dive. Humans have the ability to dive too. The average human can probably dive for about 2 minutes. The average hippopotamus can dive for about 15 minutes. What about marine mammals? Well, marine mammals can actually dive for over an hour, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. So sperm whales, for example, have been known to dive for over 90 minutes. That's an hour and a half. And elephant seals have been known to dive for almost 2 hours. So before we get into the adaptations required for such pronounced and extreme diving, let's talk about why they dive. Why do marine mammals dive? Seems like an obvious question, but it may not have an obvious answer. They don't necessarily dive for fun. Mostly they dive for finding food. Because they are living in the marine environment, their food is in the ocean. So in order to find their food, capture it, they need to dive down to where their food is located. So of course, this poses a really interesting problem. When a marine mammal dives, they have to hold their breath for a very long period of time, much longer than usually 2 minutes. So some of the champion divers can hold their breath for, as I said, almost 2 hours, which is an enormous amount of time. A human could never hold their breath for that long. They would die. So holding one's breath is known as apnea. So clearly, marine mammals are champions at not only diving, but obviously dealing with the challenges of apnea. So let's take a look at apnea in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, marine mammals are remarkable for their ability to dive for long periods of time and also achieve this very prolonged apnea. And I really want to drive something home here. Because apnea is so pronounced, this really makes their bodies have to work very, very hard in order to make sure that enough oxygen is sent to their cells. Because remember, cells continuously need oxygen. And if they don't get enough oxygen, they starve and the cells actually die. The oxygen, of course, is required for the energy, ATP, to pay for all the cellular work. So for humans, we make sure that we always have enough oxygen by continuously breathing. We can't undergo apnea for prolonged periods of time, but marine mammals can, and this is where they're truly remarkable. In other words, they've come up with some amazing adaptations that allow them to deliver the oxygen continuously to their cells while they are diving. And remember, while they are diving, they are not replenishing the air in their alveoli, which means that the concentration gradient is not going to be favorable for oxygen loading in the blood. And moreover, we see this very interesting trend. The deeper the food source, the more pronounced the adaptations are going to be for diving and apnea. So an exquisite example of this is going to be the sperm whale. The sperm whale can actually dive for 90 minutes or so. And their food source, of course, is going to be the giant squid, which is down 2,000, 3,000 meters underneath the ocean surface. That's amazing. So you've got these sperm whales that need to get down 2,000 or 3,000 feet. And in order to do that, they have to take a breath at the surface and then dive for a very long time in order to make it down that far. So in this sense, not all marine mammals are going to be equal in their ability to dive. Ones that tend to feed in the shallower areas tend to have less pronounced adaptations for apnea. In other words, they can't hold their breath for as long. And then the champion divers, the ones that are searching really deep for the food, the elephant seals and the sperm whales, they're going to be holding their breaths for long periods of time. And finally, I want to come back to this idea that marine mammals have a very high oxygen requirement. The brain requires a lot of oxygen, and without it, the brain dies. So in humans, if they lose oxygen for more than maybe a couple minutes, irreversible brain damage begins. That's how important it is. Marine mammals, especially cetaceans, have very large brains, which is helpful for intelligence, but it also means that long diving and apnea is going to be more of a challenge, more so than, let's say, other diving organisms like sea turtles, which have smaller brains. And with that, I'll see you next time.